The logging road didn't appear on most maps. It had been carved into the side of the Bitterroot Mountains by bulldozers in the 1960s, a single lane of compacted gravel and frozen dirt that clung to the mountain face the way a scar clings to skin. In February of 1998, that road was the only thing standing between a logging company's survival and a $340,000 contract going to ruin. Alton Zimmer had been standing on it since Tuesday. He was 44 years old, built like a man who had spent 2 decades lifting things that didn't want to be lifted, with hands that were permanently rough and a jaw that sat tight when he was thinking hard. He had started Big Sky Recovery Services in 1987 with a single used wrecker, a bank loan that had taken him 6 years to pay off, and a slogan he'd had painted on every vehicle he'd ever owned: no job too big, no recovery too tough. On this Thursday morning in February, standing on a grade so steep that loose gravel rolled downhill on its own, Alton Zimmer was quietly rehearsing what it would feel like to admit that the slogan was wrong. 3 days earlier, on Monday afternoon, a fully loaded Kenworth logging truck had been hauling 65 tons of Douglas fir timber down this same road when the rear tandems hit a patch of ice hidden under fresh snow. The trailer went sideways in under 2 seconds. The truck jackknifed, and then the whole rig, all 65 tons of it, slid off the road's edge and buried itself into the side hill rear axles, plowing 3 feet deep into frozen mud, the load of timber still chained to the bed, the driver walking away with bruised ribs in a story he would tell for the rest of his life. The logging company had called Big Sky Recovery within the hour. Alton had driven through the night to get here. He had brought his company's best asset, a Century 9055 rotator wrecker, $400,000 of computerized hydraulic engineering capable of lifting 55 tons under ideal conditions. It had a rotating boom that could reposition without moving the truck, outriggers that deployed from 4 points to anchor the machine against pull forces, and enough raw lifting power that Alton had used it to upright a capsized river barge the previous summer without breaking a sweat. These were not ideal conditions. The Kenworth sat on a 22-degree section of the logging road. To understand what 22 degrees means in practice, you have to feel it under your boots. Walking uphill on that grade required leaning your entire torso forward just to keep from sliding back. Standing still required constant micro-adjustments from every muscle below your waist. The ground itself, frozen mud over loose shale, offered no reliable surface for anything that needed to stay fixed in place. And the rotator's 4-point outrigger system, the engineering marvel that made it the most capable recovery machine Big Sky Recovery owned, required exactly that: a fixed surface to anchor against. On the first morning, Alton's lead operator had deployed 2 outriggers and felt the machine begin to slide within 40 seconds. He retracted them, repositioned, tried again. Same result. The frozen mud over shale gave way under point load pressure, the way ice gives way over moving water suddenly and without warning. By Tuesday afternoon, after 6 hours of attempts from multiple positions, the operator had walked over to Alton and said what needed to be said. His name was Clovis Thatcher. He was 35 years old, had been running heavy recovery equipment since he was 22, and had never once refused a job in 8 years of working for Alton. He did not say it quietly. He said it standing in front of Burton Calloway, the logging company's site supervisor, and 2 members of Burton's ground crew, because Clovis Thatcher was not the kind of man who said important things where only the right people could hear them. "Alton," he said, "if I deploy on that grade with this machine, we are going over the side. This rotator was not built for mountain logging roads. I won't do it." The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. Alton counted them. He did not argue. Clovis was correct on every technical point, and Alton knew it. But Clovis had said it out loud in front of the logging company's supervisor on a job site where Big Sky Recovery had now spent 2 days and accomplished nothing. The slogan on the side of Alton's truck was visible from where they were standing: no job too big, no recovery too tough. Burton Calloway did not look at it. He was too polite for that. But Alton saw him not look at it, which was somehow worse. Alton called 3 other recovery companies that afternoon. Emmett Ellsworth drove out from Missoula, walked to the edge of the slope, stood there for 90 seconds, and said he couldn't help. 2 other outfits from further east sent the same answer by phone after Alton described the grade and ground conditions. Before Ellsworth drove away, he said something that stayed with Alton longer than any of the technical refusals. Alton, I've known this slope for 10 years. I already knew it couldn't be done before I drove out here. You called me because you ran out of people to call, not because you thought I had an answer. He was right. Alton stood at the edge of the road and watched Ellsworth's truck disappear around the lower switchback, and he understood that what Ellsworth had described was not an accusation. It was just the shape of the situation as it actually was. The logging company was losing $15,000 a day in missed deliveries. The insurance adjuster, a man named Dewey Vardell from a regional firm out of Billings, was scheduled to arrive Monday morning to document the loss and begin the process of declaring the Kenworth a total write-off. When Vardell signed his paperwork, the truck and its load would become a salvage matter, not a recovery matter. The contract window would close. The timber would be abandoned on the slope until spring thaw made extraction possible by other means, by which point the delivery deadline would be 6 weeks gone and the contract would be dead. Alton drove his truck to a flat section of the road a quarter-mile below the site and sat in it as the temperature dropped towards single digits. He called home at 9:30. His wife Velma answered on the second ring. She had been married to Alton for 19 years, which was long enough to hear the specific silence that came before bad news. "How bad?" she said. "Nobody can pull it," Alton said. "The grade is too steep. The ground won't hold outriggers. I've called everyone." Velma did not say she was sorry. She was a practical woman, the kind who ran the company's books with the same precision she applied to everything else. And what she said was, "The company is losing money every day you're on that mountain. The insurance adjuster comes Monday. Alton, if you cannot solve this, you need to say that and let the adjuster do his job. Don't let your pride burn down 11 years of work." Alton looked out through the windshield at the darkness of the mountain slope. "I know," he said. "Do you?" He did not answer, which was its own kind of answer. He sat in his truck for another hour after hanging up. One thing Velma had said stayed with him. Not the practical part, though she was correct about all of it. What stayed was the word pride, the way she had put it directly next to 11 years of work, as if one of those things had been quietly threatening the other for a long time, and she had simply chosen tonight to say it plainly. He had not built Big Sky Recovery on pride. He had built it on solving problems that other people walked away from. Those two things had felt like the same thing for so long that he had stopped noticing the difference. Tonight, on a frozen mountain road with his best machines sitting idle and his best operator's refusal still hanging in the cold air, the difference was suddenly very clear. He did not sleep well in the truck cab. He slept in his short stretches, waking each time to the sound of wind pushing through the pines on the uphill side of the road. And each time he woke, he looked up the slope toward where the Kenworth sat invisible in the dark 65 tons of timber and steel that the mountain had simply decided to keep. Wednesday passed in the specific misery of a problem that has no solution. Alton walked the site 3 more times looking for ground conditions he might have missed, angles of approach he hadn't considered. Clovis worked alongside him without being asked, carrying a grade level and a soil probe, checking frozen depth at a dozen points on the slope. They did not talk much. There was a kind of respect in that, the respect of two men who understood the same problem and were giving it its due weight. What Clovis found was consistent. The frozen layer was 4 to 6 inches deep, and below it was a mixture of clay and shale gravel that had the structural integrity of wet concrete when frozen, but would behave like loose fill the moment outrigger pressure exceeded a certain threshold. The threshold was well below what the rotator needed to operate safely. By Wednesday evening, Alton had accepted in the quiet interior way that acceptance actually works, that he did not have a solution. He had not said it out loud yet. Saying it out loud was the part that would take until Monday. Thursday morning arrived, gray and hard temperature at 24 degrees Fahrenheit. When Alton walked out to the site at first light, Burton Calloway was already there, standing at the edge of the slope with a cup of coffee, looking down at the Kenworth, the way a man looks at something he has been staring at long enough that he stopped really seeing it. They were standing there together, not saying much, when Burton's radio crackled. It wasn't a call intended for them. It was a different frequency picked up by proximity, the voice of an older man talking to someone else about a piece of equipment, about a slope, about a name. The name was Kowalski. Burton turned the volume up slightly, looked at Alton. 20 minutes later, Burton's phone rang. The man on the other end introduced himself as Garland Kowalski. He said he had been listening to his scanner that morning and had heard Alton's conversations with the logging company, Heard Alton say that no recovery service in Montana would touch the job because the grade was too steep and the physics didn't work. He said he knew the slope on Lolo Ridge. He said he thought he could help. He said he had a wrecker. Old one, he said, but built for mountain work. Army surplus, 1947, built for tank recovery. Burton handed the phone to Alton. Alton listened to Garland Kowalski describe his equipment for 90 seconds. A 1947 Diamond T-969, a machine that Garland's father had purchased at a military depot in Washington state after the war. A machine that had been used to pull logging equipment off mountain roads in the Bitterroot for nearly 30 years before sitting in a barn for the past 3. Alton handed the phone back to Burton and said, "Tell him to come up." He said it without enthusiasm because what he felt in that moment was not hope. What he felt was the specific courtesy a man extends when he has run out of real options and needs to be able to say when the insurance adjuster arrives Monday that he had tried everything available to him. An old man with a 50-year-old surplus wrecker was not a solution, but he was something to point to. What none of them knew yet was what was happening 12 miles down the mountain at that exact moment in a weathered barn on a property outside of Darby. Garland Kowalski was 76 years old. He had spent 55 years working timber in western Montana, starting as a choker setter in 1943 when he was 21 years old, and timber was being harvested as a wartime strategic resource. He had worked in old-growth stands that no longer existed on roads that had been reclaimed by forest with equipment that was now in museums. He knew the Bitterroot drainage the way men know things that took decades of physical presence to learn, not as information, but as instinct, as the particular weight of judgment that comes from having been wrong on a mountain once and learning exactly what that costs. His father, Dwight Tilden, had come from Norway in 1919 and spent his working life in the timber industry of western Montana. When the war ended and the Army began liquidating its equipment, surplus by the trainload, Dwight had driven to a depot in Washington state and paid $1,400 for a 1947 Diamond T-969. It was a Class 40 tank recovery vehicle. It had been built to pull disabled Sherman tanks 30-plus tons of armor out of European mud off bombed roads up mountain passes in Italy and France. The Army had ordered hundreds of them. When peace came, they sold them as surplus. Most were scrapped. A few ended up in the hands of men like Dwight Tilden, who understood what the machine actually was and what it could do. The Diamond T was not a civilian wrecker that happened to look military. It was a purpose-built combat recovery vehicle, and the differences between it and any civilian machine were not cosmetic. They were foundational. The transmission had a first gear so low that the truck could sustain enormous pulling loads at 2 miles per hour while the engine ran barely above idle. This was not an accident of engineering. It was a specific design response to the problem of pulling a 30-ton tank up a 20-degree grade on a road destroyed by artillery, where mechanical sympathy and relentless, sustained power mattered more than speed. The boom was a fixed vertical tower built from heavy steel I-beams, not an extendable rotating arm, which meant Garland could apply upward, pulling force at a steeper angle than any modern rotator could manage. And the machine weighed 22,000 pounds, with that weight concentrated over the rear tandem axles, so that when the winch pulled forward, the reactive force pressed the rear tires down into the ground rather than trying to push outriggers sideways through frozen earth. Dwight had used the Diamond T from 1947 until 1976 when he died. Garland inherited it and used it through the 1980s and into the early 1990s, until the larger logging operations began keeping their own recovery equipment, and the independent calls slowed down. By 1995, the Diamond T had been parked in the barn. Garland started it twice a year to keep the engine alive, checked the hydraulics, kept the winch cable lubricated. He had no specific reason to believe he would ever use it again. He kept it running because letting it die felt wrong in a way he could not precisely articulate. On this Thursday morning, after hanging up with Burton Calloway, Garland stood in the barn for 3 minutes before he touched the vehicle. The barn was cold. His breath came out in visible clouds. The Diamond T sat in the shadows at the back, massive and still, the military cab boxy and angular, still showing traces of olive drab under the faded red paint Dwight had put over it in the 1950s. The vertical boom rose like a tower in the dim light. The U.S. Army markings on the winch cable were still legible. Garland was aware of several things simultaneously. He was aware that his left knee had been unreliable on uneven ground since a fall in 1991. He was aware that his hands in cold temperatures had developed a slight tremor in the last 2 years that he had not mentioned to his doctor or to anyone else. He was aware that he had not operated this machine in a genuine working situation in 4 years, and that the kind of judgment required on a live slope with a load in motion and forces that responded to decisions in real time was not the kind of thing that came back immediately after years of inactivity. He was also aware of the slope on Lolo Ridge. He had pulled equipment off steeper grades than that in the 1950s and 1960s, when logging roads were nothing but raw bulldozer cuts, and the only machines available for recovery were the ones that had been built during the war. He knew what the Diamond T could do on that kind of terrain because he had watched it do it first with his father running the winch, then himself. The question that the 3 minutes of stillness was answering was not whether the Diamond T could pull the Kenworth off that slope. Garland was confident about the machine. The question was whether he still could, whether the man who had spent his career on mountain roads, who had read terrain through the soles of his boots and the vibration of a steering wheel, was still inside the 76-year-old body standing in this cold barn. He put his hand on the hood. The metal was cold enough to pull heat from his palm. Under the red paint, under the olive drab beneath it, was steel that had been manufactured in 1947 for the hardest work imaginable. His father had chosen this machine. His father had kept it running. Garland had kept it running through that. He climbed up into the cab. The engine turned over on the third attempt, coughed twice, and settled into its deep, grinding idle. The sound of it filled the barn. Garland sat and listened to the rhythm of it, feeling the vibration come up through the seat and the steering column, checking for anything irregular in the tone or the timing. The engine sounded the way it always had. He backed the Diamond T out of the barn and pointed it toward the mountain. 2 hours later, the sound of the machine announced itself before it was visible. The low grinding of the engine in first gear, the particular mechanical cadence of a vehicle operating at absolute minimum speed under its own considerable weight, came echoing off the rock faces above the logging road before anyone on the site could see the truck itself. Burton Calloway heard it first and walked to the upper edge of the road to look down toward the lower switchbacks. Then everyone heard it. Then everyone saw it. The Diamond T969 came around the lower bend doing 8 miles per hour in first gear, and it was not what anyone on the site had been picturing. It was massive. The cab was taller than most modern heavy trucks, angular and utilitarian in the way that only military equipment from that era managed to be built, with a specific geometry of function, without any concession to comfort or appearance. The olive drab showed clearly through the faded red in the morning light. The vertical boom rose behind the cab like an industrial monument fabricated from steel I-beams in dimensions that suggested whoever designed it had been told to build for loads they hadn't fully specified yet. The winch drum behind the boom was large enough that the cable wrapped around it in layers. The machine looked like what it was, equipment built for a war surviving into a peacetime world that had largely forgotten the specific problems it had been designed to solve. Alton stood with Clovis Thatcher and 2 members of Burton's ground crew and watched it come. After a moment, Alton started laughing. It was not a cruel laugh exactly, but it was not a kind one either. It was the laugh of a man with a $400,000 machine sitting idle 20 yards away, watching a 51-year-old military surplus vehicle come grinding up a logging road in first gear. "Is that what I think it is?" Alton said. Clovis stood with his arms crossed, watching the Diamond T negotiate the last switchback before the flat staging area. His expression was not amusement. It was the focused, slightly narrowed look of a man running calculations. The Diamond T pulled onto the flat area and stopped. The engine idled for a moment, then went quiet. A long moment passed. Then the cab door opened, and Garland Kowalski climbed down. He was a tall man, or had been now, slightly compressed by age into something still imposing, but more deliberate. He moved with the careful economy of a 76-year-old body that knew exactly which movements cost what. He was wearing a wool work coat, thick gloves, and boots that had been resoled at least twice. He did not look at the Kenworth first. He looked at the slope. Alton walked over. He was still managing his expression, keeping the amusement at a level that was technically polite. He introduced himself. Garland gave his name and shook Alton's hand with a grip that told Alton something about the man's working history without requiring explanation. "Burton said you think you can pull that Kenworth," Alton said. I know I can, Garland said. Alton gestured at the Diamond T. With all respect, that truck is from 1947. I've got a rotator that costs $400,000 and it cannot anchor on that slope. What makes you think that machine does better? Garland looked at the rotator, then at the slope, then back at Alton. When he spoke, he was not performing patience. He simply had it. Your rotator needs 4-point outrigger deployment to operate at capacity. On that slope with that ground, you cannot anchor. The Diamond T does not use outriggers. The weight sits over the rear tandem. When the winch pulls, the reactive force presses the rear tires into the ground. The lower the gear, the more sustained the pull at lower force peaks, which means the machine does not lurch, does not spike the load, does not give the ground a reason to shift. He paused. I am not trying to overpower that slope. I am trying to work with it. There is a difference. Clovis Thatcher stepped forward. He had been listening with the particular attention of someone checking a technical argument against his own knowledge as it unfolded. The vector forces on a 22-degree grade don't work out, Clovis said. When you apply uphill tension on that slope, the cable wants to pull your machine uphill too. You'll lose rear traction and slide before you build enough line tension to move the Kenworth. Garland turned to look at Clovis directly. The Army used these machines in Italy in 1944 and 1945, he said. Mountain roads, grades steeper than this. They designed the gearing specifically for the vector problem. Low enough speed, high enough mechanical advantage weight distribution over the pull axis. They understood it. The machine reflects what they understood. Clovis had no immediate response to this. Not because the argument was unanswerable on technical grounds, but because there was something in the delivery of it, the specific flatness of a man citing a 50-year-old engineering solution with complete personal confidence that created a kind of pause in the conversation. Alton shook his head. Garland, I appreciate it, but I can't let you risk your life on that slope. My insurance won't cover me watching you try. Burton Calloway, who had been standing back, moved forward. Alton, he said, let him try. We have nothing to lose. He paused. I knew the Kowalski name before today. My father worked these same roads. If Garland says he can do it, I believe him. Alton looked at Garland, looked at the Kenworth on the slope above, looked at his rotator, $400,000 of equipment that had not moved the load 1 inch. Fine, Alton said. I'm recording this. If that machine goes over the side, I want documentation that it was not my company's operation. Garland looked at him with an expression that was not offense and not amusement. It was something more settled than either of those things. Record whatever you want, he said. You're going to want to watch it again. He turned back to the Diamond T and began the work of rigging. What happened next was something that none of the men standing on that staging area had seen before. Not because it was dramatic in any visible way, but because it was so completely unhurried. Clovis Thatcher, who had crossed his arms and planted himself in the position of a skeptic, waiting for confirming evidence, watched Garland begin the process of positioning his machine and pulling cable, and found himself, without making any deliberate decision, walking toward the slope to get a better angle on what the old man was doing and why. Burton Calloway, without a word to anyone, picked up an end of the military-spec cable that Garland had begun unreeling from the drum and held it. Garland looked at him, nodded once. 2 of Burton's ground crew followed their supervisor's lead and came forward without being asked. Alton stood with the camcorder. Clovis stood where he had planted himself watching. And on the staging area of a mountain logging road in the Bitterroot Range, with the temperature holding at 24 degrees and the light of a February morning flat and gray against the snow, a 76-year-old man who had not been certain that morning whether he was still the person he had spent his life becoming, began to lay out his rigging with the same methodical patience that the machine behind him had been built to embody. He did not rush. There was no version of this that rewarded rushing. He checked each point of contact 3 times, not because he doubted the equipment, but because 3 times was the number that his father had taught him, and his father had never been wrong about that. He chose the position for the Diamond T on the firmest ground, could locate 150 feet below the Kenworth on the fall line of the slope. He ran the cable through snatch blocks, secured to trees on the uphill side, creating a pulley system that would triple his mechanical advantage while keeping his pull angle favorable. He selected the attachment point on the Kenworth's frame with the care of a man who understood that the point of connection determines the geometry of everything that follows. The attachment point he chose was not the standard recovery point. Any trained wrecker operator would have used the standard point. Garland chose a frame location that under load would pull the Kenworth simultaneously forward and upward, shifting weight from the buried rear axles onto the front axle where the ground was firmer. Alden watched him make that choice from a distance and lowered the camera from his face for a moment. He did not say anything, but something in his expression changed. When Garland had completed the rigging to his satisfaction, he took 2 minutes to walk the line of the cable from the drum to the Kenworth, checking each block, each anchor point, each connection. Then he walked back to the Diamond T and climbed into the cab. The cab had no doors. It had a roof and a windshield, and an open frame where doors would have been, because it had been designed for men who needed to be able to exit quickly in a combat zone. And no one had ever added doors because Dwight Tilden had not believed in modifying things that were already correct. It was 24 degrees outside. Garland did not seem to notice. He engaged the winch and put the transmission in first gear. The Diamond T began to move. The cable did not snap tight the way cables do in movies. It came to tension the way a river comes to flood, gradually, and then all at once the slack running out of the line in visible waves that traveled from the winch drum up the slope to the first snatch block, and then redirected toward the Kenworth's frame, and by the time the last of the slack was gone, the cable was humming at a frequency you felt in your back teeth before you heard it with your ears. Garland Kowalski sat in the open cab of the Diamond T with both hands on the wheel, not because steering was required at 2 miles per hour on flat ground, but because the wheel transmitted information. The vibration that came up through the column told him how the load was distributing across the pulley system. An even vibration meant the forces were balanced. An uneven one meant something was shifting that he needed to account for before it became a problem he couldn't account for. The vibration was even. He held the throttle steady, let the winch do what it had been built to do. On the slope above, nothing visible happened for 30 seconds. The Kenworth sat exactly where it had been sitting for 3 days. The cable ran up the mountain at its precise angle, taut, and still connecting the old military machine at the bottom to the buried logging truck at the top, and for 30 seconds, the only evidence that anything was happening at all was the low grinding of the Diamond T's engine and the almost subsonic hum of tension living in a cable stamped with U.S. Army markings. Then the Kenworth moved, not dramatically, not with the sudden lurch of a vehicle breaking free from a grip. It moved the way glaciers move, which is to say it moved in a way that was only visible if you had been watching the exact same reference point for long enough to notice that the reference point was no longer where it had been. The rear end lifted perhaps 2 inches as the weight redistributed forward. The frame settled, and then the whole rig slid uphill 8 inches on the frozen slope. 8 inches. Alton Zimmer lowered his camcorder from his face. He was still recording. He just wasn't watching through the lens anymore. Clovis Thatcher, standing 30 feet downslope from the Diamond T at the angle he had chosen for observation, took 1 step backward without meaning to. Garland held the tension exactly where it was. He did not advance the throttle. He did not celebrate. He sat in the open cab in 24 degrees of Montana winter and let the load settle into its new position, reading the vibration through the steering column, waiting for the moment when the system told him it was ready for the next pull. This was the part that could not be taught from a manual. A modern recovery operation runs on instrumentation on load cells and hydraulic pressure gauges and the computerized feedback systems that tell an operator exactly what forces are in play at every moment. Garland had none of that. What he had was 55 years of accumulated physical knowledge about how loaded vehicles behave on slopes, how frozen ground transfers force, how a cable under tension communicates the status of everything it connects to the hands of the person holding the other end. He was reading the Diamond T the way a physician reads a patient, not through numbers, but through a lifelong accumulation of knowing what normal feels like and recognizing the first moment it begins to deviate. The vibration told him the load had settled. He advanced the throttle slightly. The winch drum turned. The cable took up the new slack. Pull, hold, settle. He did it again. The Kenworth moved another 6 inches. On the staging area, the logging company's ground crew had stopped pretending to do other things. They were watching. Not with the folded arms posture of men expecting a failure, but with the forward lean of men watching something they did not fully understand and were not sure they had ever seen before. Burton Calloway stood at the edge of the flat area where the slope began, arms at his sides, watching the cable. He had grown up hearing his father talk about Dwight Tilden, the way men talk about people whose capabilities have passed from fact into something closer to legend over the years. His father had worked these same roads in the late 1950s, had seen the original Diamond T at work more than once, had described it with the specific reverence that working men reserve for equipment that does what equipment is supposed to do in the conditions where it actually has to do it. Burton had always assumed some portion of that reverence was the distortion of memory, the way time improves what it remembers. He was no longer sure about that. Alton had walked to a position where he could see both the Diamond T and the Kenworth simultaneously. He was doing the thing he had been doing since Tuesday, which was looking at the problem from every available angle, hoping to understand it better than he currently did. What he was understanding, watching Garland work, was that he had been thinking about the problem incorrectly from the beginning. He had been thinking about it as a force problem. How much force could be applied and whether it was enough. What Garland was doing is not a force problem. It was a patience problem. The mountain was not something to overcome. It was something to work with in increments over time until the geometry of the situation had been changed enough that the truck could move on its own terms rather than being moved on yours. Alton had been in the recovery business for 11 years. He was looking at something he had not seen in 11 years of the recovery business. At minute 22, he heard the first sound that was not the engine and not the cable hum. It came from the upper section of the slope near the highest snatch block, and it was the sound of something that was almost right but not quite. A faint creak, lower in pitch than the cable tension, hum higher than the engine note. The kind of sound that exists at the edge of perception and lodges in the back of the brain before the conscious mind has identified it. Burton heard it at the same moment Alton did. They looked at each other. Then both of them looked up the slope toward the highest anchor point. The snatch block at the top of the system was attached to a tree on the uphill side of the road, a mature ponderosa pine that had looked solid when Garland selected it 90 minutes ago. What neither Garland nor Burton had been able to fully assess from below was the depth of the root system in the frozen layer. The tree itself was healthy, but the frozen soil layer was 4 inches deep, and the roots that mattered for lateral load resistance were the ones that spread horizontally in that frozen layer, and 4 inches of frozen clay over shale does not grip root systems the same way that deep unfrozen earth does. The tree was beginning to lean, not dramatically, a fraction of a degree, but under the load it was carrying, redirecting the mechanical advantage of the entire pulley system. A fraction of a degree of lean was the beginning of a sequence that ended with the block pulling free, the cable releasing its stored energy in every direction simultaneously, and 65 tons of logging truck sliding back down a 22-degree slope with nothing between it and the bottom but air. Burton opened his mouth. Garland had already seen it. He had been watching it in the passenger side mirror for 2 minutes. The mirror gave him an oblique angle on the upper anchor, not perfect, but enough to see the lean beginning. He had been making micro adjustments to the throttle for those 2 minutes, reducing the peak load on the upper block by 5 to 8%, through changes in engine speeds so small that no one watching from the staging area would have noticed them. He had been buying time without anyone knowing he was buying it. What he needed was for someone to get to that tree. "Upper block," he said. He did not shout it. He said it at a volume calibrated for a man 30 feet away, which was where Clovis Thatcher was standing. Clovis had already been looking at the tree for 45 seconds. He had the advantage of standing outside the machine with a clear sight line up the slope, and he had been watching the lean develop with the particular focus of a man who has spent 13 years around recovery operations and knows the visual vocabulary of things that are about to go wrong. He moved before Garland finished speaking. The slope was 22 degrees of frozen ground, and Clovis Thatcher went up it at a pace that made it clear he had done similar things before in similar conditions. He did not run. Running on a 22-degree ice slope is how you end up 22 degrees below where you started. He moved fast and controlled driving the edges of his boots into the surface using his hands on the slope, faced when the grade required it, and he covered the 60 feet to the upper block in under 90 seconds. He got both hands on the block housing and leaned into the tree, adding his body weight to the root system's resistance. "Go," he said. Garland advanced the throttle. The next pull moved the Kenworth 14 inches. The load peak on the upper block spiked for 3 seconds, and Clovis felt it through his palms, and his braced shoulders felt the tree trying to answer the force with the lean that its root system wanted to complete. He held his position. The peak passed, the load settled. "Move the block," Garland said. 20 feet right. There's a fir with a wider base." Clovis looked at the fir Garland meant. He could not see it from Garland's position, could not see how Garland had known it was there, and did not spend time wondering about it. He detached the block, moved it, reattached it to the fir tree, and tested the connection with his body weight before he stepped away. "Done," he said. He came back down the slope and returned to his position 30 feet from the diamond tee. His hands were shaking slightly from the cold and the exertion of fine tremor that he pressed out by clenching his fists twice and releasing them. Alton had watched all of this through the camcorder. He had kept recording, but at some point during Clovis's climb up the slope, he had started watching with the lens rather than around it, holding the camera up to his eye again, because watching through the lens gave him something to do with his hands and his face while he processed what he was seeing. What he was seeing was his best operator, the man who had publicly refused to work the rotator on this slope 36 hours ago, climbing a 22-degree iced hillside to physically hold a snatch block in place so that a 76-year-old man's 50-year-old winch could keep pulling. Alton did not know exactly when his understanding of the situation had changed. It had not been a single moment. It had been a series of moments, each one small enough to dismiss individually, accumulating into something he could no longer dismiss. Pull, hold, settle. Garland worked through 4 more cycles after the anchor crisis, each one methodical, each one reading the system through the wheel and the throttle before committing to the next advance. The Kenworth's front wheels reached firmer ground at minute 31. The angle of the load changed at that point, the forward pull becoming more purely horizontal as the front axle found purchase, and Garland adjusted the engine speed to account for the change in force geometry. He did not explain what he was doing, he simply did it. Clovis watched the adjustment happen in real time. He watched Garland's right hand move on the throttle by an amount so small it was almost invisible. Watched the cable angle respond, watched the Kenworth's movement smooth out from its previous stuttered advance into something more continuous. Clovis had been running heavy recovery equipment for 13 years. He understood what he was watching. He understood it well enough to know that what he was watching was not a technique he had been taught and then refined. It was something else, something that lived in a different part of a person than technique. At minute 35, the rear tandems broke free. The sound it made was not what any of them expected. It was not a crack or a groan or the sound of tearing earth. It was lower than that, a deep concussive pop that traveled up through the slope and through the soles of their boots before it reached their ears, and then a rushing, settling sound as 3 days of accumulated suction between frozen mud and steel axle housings released all at once. The Kenworth lurched forward 2 feet and then held. Someone in Burton's crew made a sound that was not a word. Several of them did. It was the involuntary sound of people whose bodies have released tension they had been carrying without knowing it. Dewey Vardell, the insurance adjuster from Billings, who had called that morning to say he was moving his arrival up and had reached the site 40 minutes ago, lowered his pen from the notepad. He had spent his time on site standing near his vehicle, taking notes and saying nothing to anyone. Vardell was 58 years old and had been assessing total losses for 22 years. He had seen vehicles recovered from situations that seemed impossible and situations that actually were impossible, and he had learned to tell the difference primarily by the behavior of the experienced professionals on site. Experienced professionals in his observation did not applaud. They did not make sounds of surprise. They watched with the contained attention of people who understood what they were looking at. Every person on this slope had made a sound when the rear tandems broke free. Even Clovis Thatcher, who had spent the last hour positioning himself as the most skeptical person on site, had exhaled through his teeth in a way that was not professionally contained at all. Vardell looked down at his notepad. He had written the phrase "total loss likely" 40 minutes ago when he arrived and assessed the situation. He had not crossed it out yet. He was considering whether to cross it out. He was also considering his conversation with Alton's wife. Velma Zimmer had called him that morning not to argue but to inform him. She had explained that an independent operator was on site, that the recovery was in progress, and that she would appreciate it if he withheld any formal documentation until the situation resolved. Her tone had been the tone of a woman who understood exactly which leverage points were available to her and was applying them with the precision of long practice. Vardell had not appreciated the call, but he had also not ignored it. He was not ignoring what he was watching now. Garland worked the Kenworth up the remaining distance with the same rhythm he had used from the beginning. Pull, hold, settle. The front wheels were on good ground now. The rear tandems, freed from 3 days of frozen captivity, were on marginal ground but moving. The load of timber rode on the truck bed exactly as it had been loaded, the chains still tight, the furlogs still stacked in the order they had been placed. Nothing had shifted. Nothing had been damaged. At minute 42, Garland stopped. He stopped without warning, with no apparent reason visible to anyone watching. The winch went quiet. The engine idled. The Kenworth sat on the slope with its front axle on solid ground and its rear still transitioning through a zone that no one from the staging area could read clearly. 90 seconds passed. Clovis broke the silence. He had moved from his observation position during the anchor crisis and had not gone back to it. He was standing perhaps 20 feet from the Diamond T now, in a position that was no longer the position of a spectator. "You see that ice layer?" he said. It was not a question. "5 minutes ago," Garland said. Clovis looked at the section of slope where the rear tandems were about to travel. The frozen surface there looked continuous, but there was a slight color variation in the ice layer, a translucent quality that indicated a thinner freeze over something that had not solidified the same way the surrounding ground had. If the rear tandems hit that zone under tension, the tires would punch through into unfrozen mud below and sink, and the geometry of the whole situation would become worse than it had been at the start. "Move the top block 20 feet right," Clovis said. "Change the pull angle. It'll steer the rear tires left of that zone before they come up." "That's what I'm deciding," Garland said. A pause. Clovis looked at the tree Garland would need, then at the angle. He ran the geometry in his head, the way he ran it every day on recovery jobs, factoring slope load cable, angle likely ground response. The solution was correct. He had arrived at it from a different starting position than Garland, using different information sources, and they had ended up in the same place. "I'll move it," Clovis said. He went up the slope for the second time. When he came back down, he did not return to his previous observation position. He stopped at 15 feet from the Diamond T and stood there. It was a small thing, but it was not the position of a man waiting for a failure. It was the position of a man who had appointed himself to a role that had not existed an hour ago. Garland advanced the throttle. The Kenworth's rear tires tracked left of the ice zone by 8 inches. They found solid frozen ground and kept moving. The load kept moving. The timber kept its chains. The whole 65-ton assembly came up the remaining distance of the slope with the gradual inevitability of something that had always been going to happen, given exactly these conditions and exactly this machine and exactly this much patience. Alton's phone rang. He almost didn't answer it. He had the camcorder in one hand, and he was watching the Kenworth with the focus of a man who does not want to look away from something he will only see once. But the phone rang a third time, and he recognized the specific ring he had assigned to Velma, and with Velma not answering, a third ring carried its own consequences. He stepped back from the group and put the phone to his ear. "Vardell called me," Velma said. "He said there's an independent operator on site with uninsured equipment, and he's concerned about liability exposure." "I know," Alton said. "Alton, if that man gets hurt on company property during an ongoing insurance assessment, we could be named in the claim." "Velma," he stopped. "What?" He looked up the slope. The Kenworth's front wheels were fully on the flat approach to the staging area now. The rear tandems were 3 feet from the edge of the last steep section. "The truck is moving," he said. A pause. "How much?" "Front axle is on flat ground. Rear is almost there." Another pause longer. When Velma spoke again, her voice had shifted in a way that only Alton could have detected, the shift of a practical woman allowing herself one moment of something that was not practical. "Does he need anything?" "No," Alton said. "He doesn't need anything." He hung up. He looked at Dewey Vardell, who was standing 30 feet away, with his notepad at his side and his pen not moving. He looked at Clovis, who was 15 feet from the Diamond T and not going anywhere. He looked at Burton Calloway, who had both hands in his coat pockets and his eyes on the cable. Then from somewhere above them on the slope there was a sound. It was the sound a wine bottle makes when the cork finally gives that deep, pressurized pop that happens when suction reverses, when the seal that is held for 3 days between frozen Montana mud and a steel axle housing reverses its grip and releases. One clean sound, then the rushing of displaced earth finding new equilibrium. Then the Kenworth was on flat ground. It happened in 3 seconds. One moment the rear tandems were at the edge of the last steep pitch. Then they were rolling forward onto the flat of the staging area, the full 65 tons of truck and timber moving under its own momentum, now not being pulled, but arriving the engine still running from 3 days ago, when the driver had never cut it, the timber load sitting exactly as it had been loaded on a clear-cut Monday morning, before the ice and the slope and everything that followed. Garland brought the Diamond T to a stop. He disengaged the winch. He set the parking brake. He sat in the cab for a moment with the engine idling. Nobody said anything. Dewey Vardell opened his notepad to the page where he had written "total loss likely" 47 minutes ago. He drew a single line through it. The line was straight and unhurried, the line of a man who has made a clear factual correction to an earlier assessment and is comfortable with what that means. Then he turned to a fresh page and began writing something different. Burton Calloway let out a long breath that he had apparently been holding for some time. One of his ground crew started to say something and stop because the staging area had settled into a silence that seemed to have its own weight, the specific silence of people who have just watched something they will be describing for the rest of their lives and have not yet worked out how to begin. Clovis Thatcher was looking at the Diamond T, not at the Kenworth, not at the timber load, not at the slope they had just moved 65 tons up. He was looking at the machine that had done it, at the fixed vertical boom and the drum-wrapped military cable and the boxy open cab where a 76-year-old man was sitting in 24 degrees of February cold and doing nothing more dramatic than disengaging a winch. Clovis had been in this business long enough to know what he had just seen. He knew the technical explanation for all of it. He could reconstruct the force calculations, the gear ratios, the anchor geometry. He had in fact been reconstructing them in real time throughout the last 50 minutes, checking Garland's decisions against his own running analysis, finding each time that the decisions were correct. That was not what he was thinking about. He was thinking about the moment on the slope 40 minutes ago when he had been standing 30 feet from the Diamond T in the position of a man who had come to watch something fail. He had stood there for 22 minutes in that position. He had offered a technical objection in the parking area that was, he now understood, not entirely about technical objections. And then a snatch block had started to fail, and he had gone up the slope without thinking about it, and something had changed in the going up that had not changed back when he came down. He did not know yet exactly what to do with that, but he knew it was true. Garland Kowalski climbed down from the cab. He moved with the same deliberate economy he had used all morning, the careful navigation of a body that knew what it could do and respected the knowledge. He walked to the rear of the Diamond T and began coiling the cable back toward the drum, working from the far end of the line back toward the machine, his hands moving in the rhythm of a man who has coiled cable 10,000 times and no longer needs to think about how. Alton Zimmer stood with the camcorder. He had not turned it off. The recording light was still red. He was looking at the Kenworth on the flat ground, then at the Diamond T, then at Garland coiling cable in the February cold with no doors on his cab and no gloves thicker than the ones he'd arrived in. Then back at the Kenworth. He had come up this mountain on Tuesday with a $400,000 machine and a slogan and 11 years of a reputation that he had built by solving problems other people walked away from. He had spent 3 days watching the mountain refuse his solution. And then a 76-year-old man had driven up in a truck older than Alton's entire career and had solved it in 50 minutes. Alton was not a man who arrived at admissions quickly. He had built his life on the premise that there was always something else to try, always another approach, always a way to make his equipment and his expertise equal to whatever the problem was. That premise had served him well for 11 years. He was standing in the wreckage of it on a flat piece of road in the Bitterroot Mountains, and he did not yet know what he was going to build in its place, but he knew with the clarity that only complete certainty produces that the building was going to have to start from something different than what he had started from before. Garland had worked his way back to the first snatch block and was detaching it from the ponderosa pine where it had held for 50 minutes. He worked without hurrying. He had somewhere to be, which was back down the mountain, and he would get there when the work was done properly, because work done properly was the only kind worth doing. Alton walked toward him. Alton walked toward Garland with the camcorder still running in his right hand, recording nothing in particular, now just pointed at the ground because he had forgotten he was holding it. Garland did not look up from the cable. He was working his way along the line, coiling it in measured loops over his forearm, moving back toward the winch drum, with the unhurried pace of a man who understood that the job was not finished until the equipment was properly secured. The Kenworth sat on flat ground 20 yards away, with its engine still running a low diesel murmur that had been running continuously for 3 days without anyone realizing it until now, when the silence of the mountain made every sound audible. Alton stopped a few feet away. He waited until Garland reached the drum and began feeding the cable back onto it before he spoke. "How much do I owe you?" Alton said. It was not quite a question. It was the sentence of a man who needed to establish that a transaction had occurred because a transaction was something he knew how to handle. A transaction had clear terms. A transaction could be settled. Garland kept feeding cable onto the drum. "Nothing," he said. Alton had expected this. He had not expected to feel what he felt when he heard it, which was something closer to discomfort than gratitude. Nothing was harder to receive than money. Nothing required something in return that Alton did not know how to give. "Garland," he said, "you just did what my $400,000 machine could not do." "My machine did what it was built to do," Garland said. "Yours did the same. Different machines for different work." "That is not an answer to what I asked." Garland finished the last loop of cable and secured the end of the drum housing. He straightened up slowly with the particular care of a man whose back had opinions about standing up quickly in cold weather. He turned to look at Alton for the first time since Alton had walked over. "My father bought that truck to help people who got stuck in places where regular equipment couldn't reach them," Garland said. "He didn't charge much. Sometimes he didn't charge at all. The truck has paid for itself more times than I can count. I don't need money from you. I needed to know if it could still do what it was built to do." Alton looked at him. "And it can," Garland said. A pause opened between them. On the slope above the staging area, one of Burton's ground crew had begun walking up to inspect the ruts left by the Kenworth's extraction, checking the road surface for damage. The diesel of the logging truck continued its patient idle. The temperature had dropped another degree while they had been working, and the sky to the northwest had the flat gray weight of more snow coming before evening. "Why?" Alton said. It was a different question than the one about money, and Garland understood that immediately. Garland looked at the diamond T for a moment before answering. At the open cab with no doors, at the vertical boom, at the U.S. Army markings still stamped on the winch cable housing. "My father kept that truck running for 30 years, he said. I kept it running for 20 more after he was gone. There were 3 years in that barn where I wasn't sure I'd ever use it again. I kept running it anyway." He paused. "Some things are worth maintaining even when you don't know if the day will come, because sometimes the day comes." Alton stood with that for a moment. The camcorder was still in his hand. He had not raised it once during this conversation. He extended his hand. Garland took it. The grip was the same as it had been 2 hours ago on the staging area, when Alton had been managing his skepticism, and Garland had been managing something more private than that. It was a different handshake now, with different information in it, though neither man would have described it that way. Clovis Thatcher had been standing 15 feet away during this exchange. He had been there long enough to hear all of it. He had not meant to stay. He had drifted to that position during the last exchange of cable work and had not moved away because moving away would have required a decision, and he was occupied with something that made decisions difficult. When Alton and Garland released the handshake, Clovis stepped forward. He did not go to Alton first. He went directly to Garland and put his hand out. Garland looked at him, took his hand. "I was wrong about the vector forces," Clovis said. "Not the math. The math was right for the equipment I was thinking about. I was wrong about which equipment applied." Garland considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "You weren't wrong to be careful," he said. "Careful is right. You just didn't have all the information." "I had enough information to stand in one place for 20 minutes, Clovis said. "That part I was wrong about." It was the most precise thing Clovis Thatcher had said all day, and it was precise in a way that had nothing to do with load calculations or grade percentages. Garland looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who has lived long enough to know the difference between an apology that costs nothing and one that costs something real. You went up that slope twice, Garland said. Second time, you didn't wait to be asked. Clovis had nothing to add to that. He nodded once and stepped back. Alton had watched all of this without the camcorder. At some point during the conversation, he had finally turned it off. The recording light went dark. He stood holding the camera at his side in the manner of a man who was no longer sure what he was going to do with the footage he had been so certain he would need. Dewey Vardell appeared at Alton's shoulder with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to inserting himself into conversations at precisely the moment they have finished saying the things that mattered. "Mr. Zimmer," Vardell said, "I'll need a few minutes of your time before I leave." Alton turned. Vardell had his notepad open and his pen ready, the posture of professional documentation returning after the anomalous pause of the last hour. "The assessment," Alton said. "The revised assessment," Vardell said. "The situation on the ground has changed materially since my arrival." He paused. "My report will reflect that the vehicle and load were recovered intact prior to formal documentation of loss. There will be no total loss claim." Alton looked at him. "Just like that." "The facts are the facts," Vardell said. "The truck is on the flat ground. The load is undamaged. The contract window is still technically open. My job is to document what is not what I expected when I drove up the mountain." He paused again, and something shifted briefly in his professional composure, not breaking it, just flexing it slightly. "I've been doing this for 22 years. I have not seen anything like what I watched this morning." He said it as pure information without decoration and closed his notepad. He walked to his vehicle and drove down the mountain. Burton Calloway had been on a radio for the last several minutes coordinating with the mill at the bottom of the drainage about revised delivery timing. He lowered the radio and looked at Alton. "We can make the delivery window," he said. 3 hours late, but inside the contract terms." He looked toward the Kenworth. "I need to get that truck moving." He started toward the logging truck, then stopped and turned back. He was looking at Garland, who had returned to the rear of the Diamond T and was doing a final check of the winch housing and the boom connections, the post-operation inspection that working men do when they have learned to care for their equipment the way they care for anything that has not failed them. "My father worked these roads starting in 1957, Burton said. "He used to talk about your father, Dwight, said he'd seen him pull equipment out of places where the physics supposedly didn't allow it." He paused. "I used to think he was exaggerating, the way you remember things better than they were." Garland straightened up from the winch housing. "Your father's name," he said. "Herschel Upchurch." Garland was quiet for a moment. "I remember Herschel Upchurch," he said. "Good man, careful. Knew when to stay back and when to come in. That's harder to learn than people think." Burton nodded once with the particular restraint of a man receiving something he had not known he was going to receive today. Then he turned and walked to the Kenworth. The logging truck's engine note changed as the driver engaged the transmission. The rig moved forward onto the logging road and began its slow descent toward the mill. The timber load riding exactly as it had been loaded 4 days ago, before ice and slope, and 3 days of failed recovery, had interrupted the simple fact of a truck moving wood from one place to another. The sound of it diminished as it went around the first switchback, and then it was gone and the staging area was quiet except for the idle of the Diamond T, and the wind beginning to move through the pines on the upper slope. Garland climbed into the cab. The engine note deepened as he engaged the transmission. The Diamond T began its turn on the staging area, the boom swaying slightly as the machine pivoted, and then it was pointed downhill and moving at 15 miles per hour in the deliberate way that it moved, which was the only way it moved without hurry and without apology. The men on the staging area watched it go. Alton watched it until it rounded the lower switchback and the sound of the engine faded into the distance of the mountain, becoming indistinguishable from the wind and then becoming nothing at all. He stood on the flat ground of the staging area with Clovis Thatcher on his left and 2 of Burton's remaining crew behind him, and nobody said anything for nearly 2 minutes. It was Clovis who broke the silence. He did not say anything philosophical. He said, "I want to understand the anchor geometry he used on the upper block, the way he calculated which tree before he could see the root system." Alton looked at him. "Not today," Clovis said, "but I want to understand it." Alton was quiet for a moment, then call him. Clovis nodded. He pulled his collar up against the wind and walked back toward the recovery vehicles, already thinking about something that had not existed in his mind as a question until an hour ago. In Darby, 12 miles down the mountain, Garland Kowalski pulled the Diamond T back into the barn at 2:30 in the afternoon. He shut the engine off and sat in the cab for a moment in the returning silence. The barn was the same temperature as the outside air, which meant it was cold, but it was out of the wind, and the absence of wind made it feel warmer than it was. Garland sat and listened to the engine tick as it cooled. He had done this after every job for 50 years, sat in the cab and let the machine settle before climbing out. It was not a ritual exactly. It was simply the right way to treat equipment that had worked hard. He thought about the slope, about the 90 seconds he had spent on the barn floor that morning, with his hand on the hood, not sure whether the man who had driven this truck for 30 years was still inside him. He thought about the moment at minute 22 when he had seen the snatch block beginning to fail and had known with a certainty of experience that he could manage it from the cab if he had 2 more minutes and someone on the slope. And he thought about Clovis Thatcher going up that slope without being asked the second time, especially with the ease of a man who had stopped waiting for permission to do the obvious thing. The engine had gone quiet. Garland climbed down from the cab. He walked the exterior of the Diamond T the way he always did after a job, checking the boom connections, the cable housing, the hydraulic lines. Everything was as it should be. He checked the winch drum, the cable seating on the layers, the condition of the military spec line that his father had purchased in 1947 and that he had maintained without replacement because the cable, like the machine, had been built for loads that exceeded anything civilian manufacturing considered necessary. He found nothing wrong. He put his hand on the hood of the Diamond T one more time before he went inside. The metal had cooled from the engine heat of the morning, but it was not as cold as it had been when he had put his hand there at 7 o'clock. It held a faint residual warmth from 2 hours of hard work. He went inside and called his grandson. Theron Braddock was 22 years old and lived in Missoula, where he was finishing a degree in forestry management. He answered on the second ring with the particular attentiveness of someone who knew that his grandfather did not call in the middle of a weekday without a reason. "I need you to come out this weekend," Garland said. "Everything okay?" "Everything is fine. I want to show you something about the truck. How to start it correctly, how to read the engine when it's under load." He paused. There are things that should be written down, and some things that can't be written down, so they need to be shown. Theron was quiet for a moment. "Did you use it today?" "I did." Another pause. "I'll come Saturday," Theron said. Garland thanked him and hung up. He stood in the kitchen for a moment before putting the kettle on. Through the window he could see the barn, the doors still open from when he had pulled in. He could see the rear of the Diamond T from where he stood, the boom visible above the barn doorframe. The machine sat in the shadows the way it had sat for 3 years, but it was different now in the way that things are different after they have been used. Not changed. Confirmed. The years that followed did not announce themselves as significant while they were happening. They rarely do. Significance is mostly something that gets applied in retrospect once enough time has passed to reveal which moments were the ones that actually mattered. In the spring of 1999, Alton Zimmer called Garland with a proposition. Big Sky Recovery had taken on a contract in Lincoln County that involved recovery work on mountain logging roads terrain where the company's rotator would be at the edge of its operational envelope. Alton did not ask for help. He described the job and then said, "If the grade runs above 18 degrees on the north face, I want you to know I'm going to call you before I put my equipment on it." He paused. "Not because I can't try it, because I know now what trying it costs when there's a better solution available." Garland said that was reasonable. They did not formalize anything. There was no contract, no retainer, no professional arrangement of any kind. There was simply an understanding between two men who had stood on the same slope and arrived by different routes at the same conclusion about what mattered. Over the following 4 years, that understanding produced 7 calls. 6 of them were mountain recovery situations where the Diamond T went to work, and the modern equipment stood by and learned things that were not in any manufacturer's manual. The 7th call was different. It came in the winter of 2001, and it came not from Alton, but from a logging operation in Mineral County, where a Caterpillar 235 excavator had gone over on a summer road in the aftermath of heavy rains, lying on its side on an 18-degree slope of saturated ground. 2 recovery companies had already been on site and had abandoned the attempt, After one of them sank an outrigger through the softened earth and spent 4 hours extracting their own equipment before declaring the excavator an environmental hazard to be managed rather than a recovery to be attempted. Garland arrived alone. He spent 2 hours rigging while a young equipment technician named Burl Dempsey stood nearby and watched with the particular focus of someone who is storing information rather than simply observing. Dempsey was 28 years old and had been working in heavy equipment recovery for 3 years. He had the kind of intelligence that manifests as the ability to ask the right question at the right moment. And over the course of the afternoon, he asked Garland 7 of them. Garland answered each one without abbreviation. He had no instinct for hoarding knowledge. Knowledge was only useful if it was applied, and it could only be applied by people who had it. The excavator came out in 40 minutes. When Garland was coiling cable afterward, Burl Dempsey stood close and said, "Can you teach me what you know?" Garland looked at him for a moment. "I know this grounding," he said. "I know these mountains. I know this machine. You're going to work different ground with different machines. What I can teach you is how to read what's in front of you instead of what you expected to find." He paused. "Whether that's teachable is something you're going to find out by doing it." Burl Dempsey went on to become one of the most respected mountain recovery specialists in the Northern Rockies. He was not famous for using an old equipment. He was famous for arriving at situations that had defeated other operators and solving them with the specific patience of someone who had learned from one afternoon in Mineral County that the first question was never about force. It was always about understanding. Garland used the Diamond T for the last time in the fall of 2003. He was 81 years old. The job was in Powell County, a logging truck on a switchback, and had failed in the first cold snap of the season, the road surface deteriorating faster than the season's schedule had anticipated. He arrived alone, as he always did, rigged alone, and worked the recovery with the same rhythm he had used on Lolo Ridge 5 years before. It was during the rigging that he noticed the tremor in his hands had gotten worse, significantly worse. He could complete the connections. He could inspect them. He could be certain of each one. But the motion required to get there was no longer the smooth, automatic motion of a body executing a familiar task. It was deliberate now in a different way than deliberate had ever felt before. He completed the recovery. The logging truck came off the switchback in 35 minutes. He loaded his cable, checked the boom, and drove the Diamond T back down the mountain and home. That evening, he called Theron. Theron drove out on Saturday. He spent 4 hours in the barn with Garland sitting in the cab while his grandfather pointed to every gauge, every switch, every mechanical feature of the Diamond T, and explained not just what it was, but why it was there, what problem it solved, what it told you when the conditions were working against you. Theron took notes in a small notebook. He filled 11 pages. At the end of the afternoon, Garland climbed down from the cab and stood beside the machine for a moment. "The truck needs to go somewhere it will be taken care of," he said. "Somewhere people will understand what it is." Theron looked at the Diamond T. He was thinking about the Montana Military Museum at Fort Missoula, which he had visited twice for school projects, and which he knew had a program for donated vehicles of historical significance. He did not say this yet. He was still listening. "Your great-grandfather bought this machine to do work that needed doing in places where other equipment couldn't go," Garland said. "I've tried to use it the same way. When I'm gone, it should still be doing that, even if the way it does it changes." He paused. "A museum is the right kind of use. People will see it. People will understand what was built and why. That's worth more than it sitting in a barn." Theron said he would take care of it. He meant it in the comprehensive way, not just the logistics, but the understanding, the placard, the history, the specific day on Lolo Ridge. That needed to be part of the record. He would make sure the record was complete. Garland Kowalski died in March of 2004. He was 82 years old. He had spent 61 years working the timber country of western Montana and had never once described himself as anything other than a logger who happened to own a useful piece of equipment. Theron donated the Diamond T969 to the Montana Military Museum at Fort Missoula the following year. The museum's restoration team spent 6 months returning it to the condition it had been in at the time of its military service, stripping the layers of red paint back to the original olive drab, replacing worn rubber components, ensuring the engine and winch function as they had been designed to function. When the restoration was complete, the Diamond T was placed in the main exhibition hall with a placard that documented its military history its acquisition by Dwight Tilden in 1947, its decades of service on Montana logging roads, and the February morning in 1998 when it had pulled a 65-ton logging truck off a 22-degree slope after every modern recovery company in the state had declined the job. The placard included a statement from Alton Zimmer, who had submitted it in writing when Theron contacted him during the documentation process. Alton had taken a long time with it. He had written it and rewritten it 4 times over the course of a week, and the version he finally submitted was shorter than any of the previous versions, which was the version he knew was right when he arrived at it. It said, "I spent 20 years believing that newer equipment meant better equipment. A 76-year-old logger with a World War II surplus wrecker taught me that the question is never how new the machine is or what it cost. The question is whether it was built for the work you are asking it to do." Clovis Thatcher read those words in 2007 when he drove to Fort Missoula specifically to see the Diamond T. He stood in front of the placard for a long time. Then he called Alton. "You wrote that right," he said. Alton was quiet for a moment. "I almost wrote more," he said. "There was a version that talked about the slope and the cable and the physics of it, but that wasn't what needed to be said." "No," Clovis said. "It wasn't." He stood in front of the Diamond T for another 10 minutes before he left. He looked at the open cab with no doors, at the boom, at the military cable on the drum with the U.S. Army markings still visible on the stamped metal housing, at the first gear position on the transmissions selector, which was lower than any gear position he had ever seen on any machine he had ever operated so low. It seemed like an engineering error until you understood the problem it had been designed to solve. He thought about the morning on Lolo Ridge, about standing with his arms crossed in the position of a man who expected to watch something fail, about going up the slope the first time when the block started to pull free, and the second time when the ice layer needed a different angle, and the moment between those 2 times when something had shifted in him and had not shifted back. He had spent the 9 years since that morning becoming a better operator than he had been before it. Not because he had changed his methods fundamentally, but because he had added something to his methods that he had not had before, something he could not name precisely, but that had to do with the difference between understanding a problem and understanding the ground the problem was standing on. He had called Garland once in the summer of 1999. He had asked about the upper anchor selection on Lolo Ridge, how Garland had known which tree to choose before he could fully assess the root system. Garland had answered the question directly explaining the visual cues in the frozen soil surface, the color and texture variation that indicated root depth, the way snow settlement patterns reflected the organic matter distribution below. It was a complete technical answer. Clovis had written it down. Then Garland had said, "But you're asking the wrong question." Clovis had waited. "The question isn't how I knew which tree. The question is how long he had been looking before I got there. I started reading that slope from the moment I came around the lower switchback. By the time I was rigging, I'd been reading it for an hour and a half." He paused. "The answer is always in the ground. You just have to give yourself enough time to ask it." Clovis had written that down too. He thought about it often. In 2010, Theron Braddock brought his 7-year-old son to the museum on a Saturday afternoon. The boy was named Dwight after his great-great-grandfather, though he did not yet fully understand what that name meant or where it had come from. He stood in front of the Diamond T and looked up at the vertical boom with the frank wonder of a child encountering something whose scale exceeds its category. "What does it do?" the boy asked. Theron thought about how to answer this correctly. He thought about his grandfather in the barn in the late afternoon light, pointing to each gauge and switch. He thought about the notebook with 11 pages of notes that he still had in a drawer in his house in Missoula. "It pulls things that people say can't be pulled," Theron said. The boy considered this with the seriousness that children apply to information they sense is important. "Who says they can't be pulled? People who don't know what this machine was built to do." The boy looked at the truck for a long time. He looked at the open cab with no doors and the boom rising overhead and the winch drum with its cable. He reached out and touched the fender. The metal was cool and solid and permanent under his small hand. "They were wrong," he said. "Yes," Theron said, "they were." He put his hand on his son's shoulder. Around them, the museum held its quiet, the particular quiet of places where things that mattered are given enough space to continue mattering. Through the high windows of the exhibition hall, the mountains of western Montana were visible on the horizon, The Bitterroot Range carrying its snow into the afternoon light, the same mountains that Dwight Tilden had come to in 1919, that Garland Kowalski had worked for 61 years, that had tried on a February morning in 1998 to keep something it had no right to keep. The war wrecker had gone up that mountain and come back down, and the mountain had given back what the mountain owed. Some things are built for the hardest work imaginable, and then kept running maintained through the years when the work does not come sustained by the knowledge that the kind of problem they were made to solve does not disappear simply because the world has moved on to other methods. The world moves on. The problems remain. And every so often on a frozen slope in February with the insurance adjuster coming Monday, and every modern solution exhausted, a barn door opens and an engine that has been kept alive for exactly this moment turns over on the third try and settles into its low grinding idle. And the mountain finds out that patience in the right machine with the right man at the wheel is a force that gravity cannot answer.